name's Ryan Kelpie Brown. I'm a master's student at Ohio University in the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology program, and I'm studying eastern hellbender salamanders. Eastern hellbenders are, awesome animals. They're the largest salamanders in North America, and their scientific name is Cryptobranchus Alleganiensis. And so Cryptobranchus means hidden gill. So if you think about other aquatic salamanders like mud puppies have those external gills, those like feather-like gills behind their head, where a hellbender does not have gills. So they're a completely aquatic salamander, and they live in streams. And they live in clean, healthy streams, so they're a great indicator species for the health of the stream ecosystems. And so Cryptobranchus is in the family Cryptobranchidae, which are the giant salamanders. So another name for the hellbenders, the North American giant salamander. Other names are also Allegheny alligator or snot otter, lasagna lizard, some people call them. Down in the south, I heard people call them grampus. But hellbenders, the most commonly used name. And so, our hellbenders can get pretty big, up to, over 2 feet long. They're quite striking when you see a hellbender. Some people might call them ugly. I certainly wouldn't say that. Awesome looking animals, but they say that maybe some of the first European settlers that discovered hellbenders thought wow, look at that creature. It must have crawled up from the depths of hell, and maybe it's bent on getting back there. A great indicator of quality stream health. And so their role that they play in the ecosystem is basically that of what you might call a mesopredator. Not necessarily an animal that's an apex predator at the top of the food chain, but something that's going to feed on other animals. And then there are some things that will eat hellbenders also. So, there's a lot of misconceptions about hellbenders and trout that I've heard from people up here. People think that they prey on trout that are stocked into some of the streams here, and that's not really true. I mean, it's possible that they might eat some that are small juveniles, but hellbenders are crayfish eaters for the most part. That makes up the vast majority of their diet. And so basically they do the job of keeping crayfish numbers in check in the stream. So they're eating the crayfish, keeping some of the, crayfish and other bentho macroinvertebrates in check, like hellgrammites and other insect larvae. And then they might be eaten by raccoons will sometimes get them. Otters are known to eat hellbenders, and then maybe sometimes large predatory game fish could eat them. But they spend most of their time under large rocks, so they are an obligate for basically a large shelter rock habitat. If that's not available to them in the creek, they don't live there. And what you get a lot of the times is that waterways become heavily sedimented. So usually because of land use, you get more runoff coming in. If you have deforestation, if you have more agriculture in the watershed, you're getting more runoff, more silt, more sand coming into the water. And what that'll do is bury those big rocks that hellbenders need to live under. And so if your creek is full of sand, basically, then there's not going to be anything there for the hellbenders or a lot of other species that live under rocks. Well, right now is the hellbenders breeding season. And so what we're doing up here is a transmitter study where we're looking at the movements of hellbenders both prior to and during the breeding season. So throughout a lot of the year, the hellbenders are not necessarily moving around a lot. They're a species that's considered highly sedentary, so they basically have their favorite shelter rock and they spend most of their time under that rock. And they'll go out and forage sometimes, usually at night, for crayfish, but primarily they're not making many movements throughout the season. But prior to breeding is when they tend to shuffle around a lot, and they basically try to set themselves up on good nesting rocks, nest sites where you have a quality kind of chamber that's excavated. I'm not sure that they necessarily excavate it out, but it just needs to be a chamber underneath the rock there. Yeah, so we're using these small transmitters, and they're called gastric transmitters. And so a lot of the times when you do telemetry, you might think about like radio telemetry with deer or something where you put a radio collar on them. Well, you can't really do that with a hellbender or amphibians, smaller things. So a lot of the times they'll be like surgically implanted, which is pretty invasive for the individual. So what we're doing with these gastric transmitters is basically injecting them into their throat and inserting it into the esophagus, and you have a little pill injector, press the plunger, and then that transmitter gets into their digestive system. And hellbenders have a slow metabolism, and so it takes them days, if not weeks, even up to a month to fully digest a meal when they eat it. And so that transmitter is able to stay in there for a few weeks while we're studying their movements in the creek. Yeah, we want to look at basically habitat use during breeding season, which we know are large shelter rocks, but we're taking various measurements like the number of boulders around each rock, distance to available cover, distance to the bank, velocity, a lot of different measurements at each shelter rock site to see what the hellbenders are preferring. Yeah, so we're marking these locations of the initial capture spots for the hellbenders, and I have, I think, 5 buoys out behind me. So this would be number 6. And each one of these marker bricks we've put a tag number on that corresponds with the transmitter number that's in the hellbender. So this is 11 here, which means it will be the number 11 buoy. And I'll do this to be able to record the distance between each hellbender location, and then I'll be able to make a map of exactly where they are, and we'll use that distance to know how close together the hellbenders are congregating, and if there's any kind of movement either apart or closer together during the telemetry step. Onward. You locate a hellbender that's under a certain rock, and then take all these habitat measurements of that rock, like depth and water velocity, rock size and everything, and then basically do like a random heading and a random point, a random distance that it's like a typical hellbender movement. And so you're kind of comparing used habitat to what's available, and then hopefully we plug that into the model and it can kind of tell us what they're preferring in the stream based versus what's here, kind of thing. To be a fully aquatic salamander is pretty unusual in and of itself. Like I said, there's not a whole lot of other species. The mud puppy is another one that also lives in the creek. So we've seen some mud puppies out searching for the hellbender. They breathe through their skin, and so you see these like big folds on the sides of the hellbenders. And that's how they get the lasagna lizard name. But those folds actually increase the surface area of their skin, and that helps them to breathe basically. So that's another really cool thing that we're looking at with the hellbender breeding season here. So by tracking the animals, we're also hoping to be able to find nests. The male has selected a nest chamber, found a good rock, and he's sitting in there basically waiting for a female to show up. She'll come, and if she likes that rock that he's under and she likes him, I think those mechanisms are not well understood, but she'll choose that rock and goes in there and lays her clutch of eggs. And Hellbender eggs are really cool looking. They lay them in a big string that kind of becomes this big tangled mass. But if you think of a usual frog egg, you know, they're pretty tiny, whereas the Hellbender eggs are more like the size of a 50-cent piece, and instead of like a little black dot for an embryo, they're sort of this golden yellow color, which is really cool. And so she lays the eggs in there, and the male fertilizes them externally, and at that point the female's role in the whole process is over. So she leaves right after that. She lays the eggs. Some people say the male chases her off. You know, I don't know that that's necessarily known, but she leaves the nest chamber, and then the male takes over, and he is the ultimate parent for the next 4 or 5 months. So the male guards that clutch of eggs and defends it against predators. So he'll a lot of the times just be sitting there at the chamber entrance, and any kind of crayfish or small fish or anything that tries to come into his nest chamber or an underwater camera. Also, you know, a lot of the time he'll launch out, attack. We've seen some cool shots of them, you know, going after small fish and things that approach that nest chamber. And so, yeah, he does that basically all winter long. So the eggs will hatch in about a month after they're laid, and then, you know, the little larvae, they just kind of hang out there, still in the nest cavity, and they don't disperse until, from what we've seen, usually about May. So at that point, the larvae leave the nest, the male's job is done, and he goes back to his favorite rock.
You know what the last year they were doing those was?
Probably 2015 or something. So he's an old guy, probably.
Must be some primo real estate here.
Like, why? Why here?
Yeah. Well, it's one of the mysteries.
So it's mostly going to be their mouth, I would say. You know, no claws or anything. They do have these really cool looking toes, Hellbenders do, but yeah, their teeth are like, if you've ever felt like a bass, bristly, sandpaper-like, and yeah, they've got the ability to really snap their jaws shut really quickly. So, you know, say a crayfish comes by, he chomps on them. That crayfish isn't going to be able to back out of those little hooks. Sometimes if you're handling one and, you know, he's not fond of that, they can bite you. So I've got bit by one before, but generally, I mean, you're not going to get bit by a Hellbender in the stream or anything like that. They're pretty docile animals, and even when you find one underneath a rock, you know, usually it's totally non-aggressive. They don't even, most of the time, try to, you know, take off. They're very slimy, and so I would say that's probably where that comes from. When you hold one, they almost secrete like an extra layer of slime that is real sticky and gross, and probably a deterrent for any kind of predator that wants to eat them. It's not well known why they're declining. So across their range, basically, they're showing range-wide declines. It's one of the watersheds where they seem to still be holding on and doing quite well. But in Ohio, for example, they did the first like real statewide surveys in the early 1980s. And so they got a good idea of where they were still at and the streams that they were persisting in. And since then, they've declined. They estimate about 88%. That was as of a couple years ago. So they're really dropping off in certain places. And yeah, it's not exactly understood. Water quality is the biggest assumption. It's interesting that time period where, you know, say from the late 80s to the present, is a period where water quality across the country has really improved because of like the Clean Water Act. You hear all the time about how water quality's improved, especially in major rivers where you had a lot of pollution and stuff going in. But interestingly enough, the streams that the Hellbenders were persisting in that were still, not degraded to the point where they couldn't live there, something seems to be going on in those streams that are causing these declines. And one thing that's shown to be correlated in some of the studies that they've done is conductivity, which is sort of the measure of the electrical conductance of water, but that's influenced by the dissolved ions, charged ions in the water, which usually come from human sources like mining, like runoff from cities, from agricultural areas. And the biggest thing is that, the driver of their declines seems to be lack of reproduction. They're not breeding in a lot of the streams where their populations are imperiled. And so the nests will be set up, sometimes you get eggs that are laid, and that there just seems to be nest failure. It seems like the eggs either don't hatch, or shortly after, possibly when the larvae disperse, they're not finding suitable places that they can hide to avoid predators. But what we see in a lot of our study streams in Ohio is basically a population that's only old animals. You just see these big, cool-looking, huge Hellbenders, but there's no young ones present. You don't see babies, you don't see middle-sized classes, so something's disrupting reproduction. And that's one of the other things that we're hoping to look at with this study. So we're doing the telemetry project out there and tracking the Hellbenders, hopefully leading us to a couple nests. And then we're going to take some eggs from each nest back to Ohio University, and we're going to do an experiment with conductivity. So there's a lot of things that'll influence that conductivity, and we're going to see if that has detrimental effects on the eggs and their development. Protecting the watershed is the most important things for the Hellbenders. So one thing that'll buffer the conductivity the most is forested watersheds, and just an intact ecosystem where you're not having tons of runoff, tons of sedimentation. Obviously individuals themselves really can't influence that, but if you do have property that butts up to a stream that is a known Hellbender stream, it's a great idea to not mow right up to the stream bank, to keep erosion at a minimum. Trees along the shoreline are a very good thing, so keeping your watershed healthy is important. But the thing that people, individually can probably most do is, one, spread the good word about Hellbenders, because they do have a bad reputation in some places. Like I was saying, I've talked to people who said, oh, we used to kill them when we were kids because they eat trout. And it's like, well, they don't eat trout. And, they are doing nothing but positive things for the stream. In fact, if you had, as crayfish eaters, if you had an overabundance of crayfish in an area, that's probably more detrimental to trout eggs and fry than Hellbenders ever will be. Their big shelter rocks are so important to this species. So don't disturb rocks in the stream bed, basically, especially big rocks. Leave them be. Don't flip the rocks over. A popular thing, is people like to make dams in the stream. Stone impoundments with kids, and that's fun, but you're really not only doing damage to Hellbender habitat when you do that, but all the other things that live on the stream bed. I mean, if you think about the rocks in a stream, it's almost like the trees in a forest, and that's the crucial habitat for everything there. So don't make dams, don't make rock towers, which look nice and love the art, but it's not good for the ecosystem.